In the winter of 1840, deep in the fog-choked hollows of Appalachia, 11-year-old Sarah Hadley was sold by her father to a reclusive preacher named Ezekiel Marsh for 3 silver coins and a mule. The transaction happened in silence, in a cabin where the walls sweated with dampness and secrets. By the time Sarah turned 16, she was dead, buried in unhallowed ground behind Marsh's chapel, a structure the locals called the Bone Church, because of the way it seemed to collect the dying. But Sarah's story didn't end with her burial. What happened in those 5 years between her sale and her death became the most closely guarded secret in that mountain community. A secret so vile that when the truth finally surfaced decades later, the entire town of Gallows Creek simply vanished from maps, its residents scattering like ash in wind, desperate to outrun what they'd allowed to fester in their midst. This is not just the story of Sarah Hadley. This is the story of what happens when good people choose silence, when faith becomes a mask for monstrosity, and when a child's suffering becomes the currency that keeps a community's darkest bargain alive. They found 3 silver coins in Sarah Hadley's mouth when they finally dug her up 30 years later, and that single detail, more than anything else discovered in that grave, made the Kentucky militia burn Gallows Creek to bedrock. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. To understand why those coins mattered, why grown men wept and vomited at the sight of them, lodged between the skeletal teeth of a child, you need to understand what happened on the night of January when Thomas Hadley carried his 11-year-old daughter through 2 feet of snow to a cabin that sat so far back in the mountain hollow that even the winter birds wouldn't nest near it. Sarah was barefoot. Her father had sold her shoes 3 weeks earlier for whiskey money. She'd wrapped her feet in burlap sacks tied with twine. And by the time they reached Ezekiel Marsh's door, the fabric had soaked through with blood from where the ice had cut her skin. Thomas knocked 4 times, a pattern, a code. The door opened immediately, as if Marsh had been standing there waiting, which he had been, because this transaction had been arranged weeks ago, through intermediaries, through whispered conversations after Sunday service, through the kind of negotiations that happen in the spaces between prayers, when godly men decide that some children are more expendable than others. Ezekiel Marsh was 47 years old that winter, though he looked oldest, his face carved into deep lines by what people in Gallows Creek called righteous contemplation. But what Sarah would later understand was actually the physical manifestation of something far more ancient, wearing a human face like an ill-fitting coat. He stood 6'4", unusually tall for the time, with hands that seemed to have too many knuckles and eyes that reflected lamplight wrong, showing gold when they should have shown amber. He wore black always, rough-spun wool that smelled of lye and something else, something sweet and rotten, that Sarah's child mind couldn't identify but that made her stomach clench with instinctive animal terror. He smiled when he saw her, and his teeth were perfect, too perfect, every one of them straight and white as bone china, unmarred by the rot and decay that plagued every other mouth in that hard-scrabble community. That should have been Thomas Hadley's first warning, but Thomas wasn't looking at Marsh's teeth. Thomas was looking at the leather purse Marsh held, hearing the clink of coins within it, calculating how many bottles that would buy, how many weeks he could stay submerged in the alcohol fog that made his wife's death from childbed fever 6 months ago feel like something that happened to someone else. "She's young still," Marsh said, his voice like gravel sliding down a tin roof. "But that's preferable. The young ones take to instruction better. Less resistance. Less questioning." He stepped aside, gesturing for them to enter, and Sarah felt her father's hand tighten on her shoulder, pushing her forward over the threshold into a cabin that was larger inside than it had any right to be, its interior stretching back into shadows that the fire in the hearth couldn't quite reach. The walls were lined with books, more books than Sarah had ever seen in her life, their spines cracked and ancient, titles in languages that predated English, that predated Latin, symbols that hurt to look at direct. In the center of the room stood a table, and on that table sat a contract written on parchment, so old it looked like human skin, which it was, though Sarah wouldn't learn that until much later. Beside the contract lay 3 silver coins, arranged in a triangle, and a small knife with a bone handle, carved with more of those eye-hurting symbols. "The terms are as we discussed," Marsh said, picking up the contract with fingers that seemed to bend slightly wrong at the joint. "The child becomes mine in all ways. Legal ward, spiritual charge, physical property. You relinquish all claims, all rights, all connections. As far as the law and community are concerned, Sarah Hadley died of winter fever on this date. You'll bury an empty box if anyone asks, which they won't, because children die all the time in these mountains, and grief is common as stones." He turned his gold-reflecting eyes to Thomas. "In exchange, 3 silver coins, minted before this nation existed, carrying value beyond their metal. Each coin will buy you what you need for 1 year. After 3 years, our transaction is complete, and you'll never speak of it or of her again. Break this term, attempt to reclaim her, or interfere in any way, and the coins will extract their payment from your flesh instead of your purse. Do you understand?" Thomas understood nothing except the weight of silver and the specific gravity of his own cowardice. He nodded, reaching for the coins with shaking hands that betrayed either withdrawal or conscience, though Sarah suspected the former. "She'll be cared for?" he asked, a token question, an attempt at redemption that came too late and cost too little. "She'll have food, shelter, learning." These were the questions a father should ask, delivered in the tone a father should use, but there was no conviction behind them, no steel that said he'd walk away if the answer displeased him. He was performing fatherhood as a courtesy to his own shame, nothing more. "She'll have everything she needs," Marsh replied, which was true in the most terrible way possible, because what Sarah would need to survive the next 5 years would not be food or shelter, but rather a capacity for psychological fracture that would allow her consciousness to splinter into pieces, small enough to slip between the cracks of reality, where Marsh couldn't quite reach. "She'll learn things that no school could teach her. She'll serve a purpose, higher than any she could achieve in your household. She'll become something remarkable." He extended the contract toward Thomas, then the knife. "Your mark. Blood, not ink. The old powers don't recognize ink." Sarah watched her father press the knife to his thumb, watched blood well up dark and thick, watched him smear it across the parchment in an X that would seal her fate more thoroughly than any lock or chain. The moment his blood touched the contract, the fire in the hearth flared blue just for a second, and every book on the walls seemed to shift slightly, their spines realigning with a sound like bones settling. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees in an instant, and Sarah's breath came out in visible clouds, and somewhere deep beneath the cabin, something that had been sleeping for a very long time opened eyes that had never been human, and registered the binding of a new vessel to its purpose. Thomas Hadley felt none of this. He was already counting his silver, already planning his exit, already composing the story he'd tell his neighbors about his daughter's sudden fever and quick decline. The way children sometimes just slipped away in winter, the Lord's will mysterious and absolute. "Go," Marsh said, and it was not a suggestion. Thomas went, pausing at the door only long enough to look back at Sarah with eyes that pleaded for forgiveness he didn't deserve and wouldn't receive, and then he was gone, his footsteps crunching away through snow growing fainter, disappearing entirely, and Sarah was alone with the man who'd bought her for the price of a decent horse. She stood very still, her burlap-wrapped feet leaving small bloody prints on the wooden floor, her breath still visible in the unnatural cold, and waited for Marsh to explain what happened next. He didn't, Instead, he walked to a door at the back of the cabin. One Sarah hadn't noticed before because it seemed to exist slightly outside of normal space, its edges not quite connecting with the wall around it, and opened it to reveal stairs leading down into darkness, so complete it seemed to absorb the lamplight rather than be illuminated by it. "Come," he said, and Sarah understood with the clarity that children sometimes possess, that if she descended those stairs, she would never return, not as herself, not as anything recognizable, but she also understood that she had no choice, that the contract signed in her father's blood had made choice impossible, had transformed her from human child into property, into raw material, into the 11th vessel in a sequence that stretched back almost 200 years to when this hollow was first settled by men who'd fled Europe, not for religious freedom, but because what they practiced had finally turned too monstrous even for the killing grounds of the Inquisition. So she walked forward on her bleeding feet and descended into the dark, and Marsh followed, closing the door behind them with a sound like a coffin lid, sealing, and the cabin above stood empty and silent, looking from outside like nothing more than a hermit preacher's humble dwelling. No hint of the hell that had just opened beneath its floorboards. The stairs went down much farther than made architectural sense, far deeper than any root cellar or storage basement, passing through layers of earth and stone, and something else, something that felt less like rock and more like scar tissue, like the mountain itself had been wounded here and healed wrong, leaving pockets of absence where normal matter should be. Sarah counted 147 steps before they reached the bottom, and by then the air had changed, had become thick and wet like the inside of a mouth, carrying a smell that mixed rot and incense, and something chemical that made her eyes water. The space they entered was not a room but a cathedral carved from living rock, its ceiling lost in shadow overhead, its walls covered in more of those symbol scripts that hurt to perceive directly, and in its center stood 7 pillars arranged in a circle, and chained to 6 of those pillars were children. No, Sarah realized with the horror of recognition, not children. What had been children? What remained of children after years of whatever happened in this place? They ranged in age from what must have been 7 or 8 to early teens, though it was hard to tell because their bodies had been modified, had been added to and subtracted from, in ways that defied biology. The youngest had fingers that branched and rebranched like coral, each digit splitting into smaller copies of itself until her hands looked like skeletal trees. The one beside her, a boy maybe 10, had eyes that covered most of his face, not just where eyes should be but across his forehead and cheeks. Dozens of them, all different colors, all blinking in sequence like a terrible organic code. A girl who might have been 13 had flesh that seemed to shimmer and phase, becoming transparent, then solid, then transparent again, her internal organs visible and shifting, rearranging themselves in configurations that should have been fatal but somehow weren't. They were all awake, all aware, all watching Sarah with expressions that mixed pity and hunger and something that might have been relief, because her arrival meant the sequence was advancing, meant whatever Marsh was building with their transformed bodies was nearing completion, meant their suffering might finally have purpose, or at least end. None of them spoke, but Sarah understood with sudden crystalline certainty that they couldn't, that speech had been taken from them along with their humanity, that whatever process had changed them had started with the tongue, with the removal of language, with the elimination of the ability to name what was being done to them, because naming creates power, and power creates resistance. And Marsh needed them powerless, needed them silent, needed them reduced to living materials that could be shaped without protest. "The 7th pillar," Marsh said, gesturing to the empty stone column that stood waiting, its chains hanging open like hungry arms, "is yours. You'll be bound there for the first year, while your body adjusts to the preparatory treatment. After that, you'll earn privileges, mobility within certain boundaries, tasks that take you above ground occasionally. But understand this, Sarah Hadley, who was, Sarah Nothing, who is now, you are not a child anymore. You are a component in a working that began before your grandmother's grandmother was born. You are material, and material exists to be used. He walked to a table Sarah hadn't noticed, picked up a clay cup filled with liquid that looked black in the dim light, brought it to her. Drink. This first dose will hurt. They all hurt, but this first one especially, because your body still thinks it's entirely human and must be corrected of that assumption. Sarah took the cup with hands that shook so badly the liquid sloshed, and she looked into it and saw that it wasn't black but deep red, and floating in that red were things that might have been herbs, or might have been organs, plant or animal, or something else entirely, and the smell that rose from it was the smell of her father's blood, mixed with grave dirt, and the sweet rot she'd detected on Marsh's clothes, and every instinct in her body screamed not to drink, to throw the cup and run, to choose death by fleeing into the winter night over whatever transformation this liquid promised. But then she looked at the 6 children chained to their pillars, at what they'd become, and understood that they had all made her same calculation and all arrived at the same conclusion. Some fates are worse than death, but sometimes the choosing between them is its own kind of death, and maybe survival at any cost is really just a slower way of dying. She drank. The liquid was thick and bitter and moved down her throat like something alive, like it was crawling rather than flowing, and when it hit her stomach it ignited, became fire, became acid, became 1,000 insects, eating her from inside, and she screamed, the last scream she'd make with her voice entirely her own, and dropped the cup which shattered on the stone floor, and collapsed, and Marsh caught her with his 2-jointed hands, and carried her to the 7th pillar and chained her there, with iron links that clicked shut, with the finality of a sentence being pronounced. The pain intensified, spread through her limbs like burning wire through her veins, and her vision went white, then black, then colors that didn't exist in normal human perception. And in that state between consciousness and oblivion, she felt something fundamental in her body begin to change, felt her cells receiving new instructions, felt her bones starting to hollow themselves to accommodate what would come next, felt the first stage of her transformation taking root. When she finally managed to open her eyes again, hours or days later, time moved strangely in the cathedral. The other 6 children were still watching her, and now she could understand what their expressions truly conveyed. Welcome to the sequence. Welcome to the work. Welcome to the 5 years that will end with you in the ground and 3 silver coins in your mouth, and a secret so terrible that everyone who knows it will spend the rest of their lives trying to forget or die trying. But we're not to the terrible part yet. We're still at the beginning, where the horror is relatively straightforward, where it's merely a child sold and chained and poisoned in a cavern under a mountain. The terrible part comes later, when Sarah learns what Marsh is actually building, and why the town of Gallows Creek not only allowed it, but actively participated, and what that participation cost them when the debt finally came due. Above ground, in the cabin that sat alone in its cursed hollow, the fire in the hearth burned blue-green and never needed wood, feeding instead on something invisible that leaked from the stones themselves. Outside, the snow fell harder, burying Sarah's bloody footprints, erasing the last evidence that she'd ever walked this earth as a free child. And in town, 3 miles down the mountain, Thomas Hadley sat in a tavern with a silver coin on the bar before him, buying drinks for anyone who'd listened to his tragic tale of a daughter lost to winter fever, performing grief with the skill of long practice, and no one questioned his story because no one wanted to question it, because questions led to uncomfortable places, to the acknowledgement of things better left buried, to the recognition that Gallows Creek had made certain bargains long ago, and children like Sarah Hadley were simply the interest payments coming due. In the church at the center of town, the one the locals called St. Mercy's, but that everyone knew was really the public face of Marsh's operation, the one where families brought their dead for blessing and their sick for prayer, the bell rang once, a deep tone that carried farther than it should have, and everyone who heard it felt a chill that had nothing to do with winter, felt a recognition of transaction completed, felt the invisible weight of complicity settle a little heavier on their souls. The town doctor, a man named Horace Webb, who'd presided over more child deaths than any plague could account for, heard the bell and closed his medical bag with shaking hands and poured himself whiskey he didn't taste. The mayor, Samuel Pritchard, heard it and looked at his own daughter sleeping peacefully in her bed and wondered not if, but when his turn would come to make Thomas Hadley's choice. The school teacher, the blacksmith, the baker, the innkeeper, every adult in Gallows Creek who'd lived there longer than 5 years, they all heard that bell and knew what it meant, and did absolutely nothing, because doing nothing was the bargain, was the trade, was how you kept your own children safe, and your own life comfortable, in a place where comfort came at a price measured in the suffering of children. Nobody missed from families, everybody knew were expendable. This is the part where a normal story would pause to explain why, would give you the backstory of how this evil took root, would provide context that made the townspeople's complicity comprehensible, if not forgivable. But there is no comprehensible context for what Gallows Creek allowed. There's no backstory that makes it acceptable. There's only the bare fact of the thing. An entire community participated in the systematic torture and murder of children for 200 years, and they did it not because they were forced or deceived, but because it made their lives easier, their harvests better, their children healthier, their pockets heavier. And when you weigh the suffering of a few against the prosperity of many, certain kinds of people will always choose prosperity. Sarah Hadley was not the first child sold to Ezekiel Marsh. She was the 11th in his personal sequence, but Marsh himself was just one in a line of caretakers that stretched back to the Hollow's founding. And if you totaled all the vessels across all the sequences across 2 centuries, you'd arrive at a number around 350, which is roughly 1 child every 8 months, which is a genocide committed in slow motion, which is an atrocity measured not in sudden violence, but in steady, methodical consumption. And the worst part, the detail that Sarah would learn only in her final year, the truth that would break what remained of her mind even as it explained everything, was this: the working wasn't even necessary. The prosperity, the health, the wealth that Gallows Creek enjoyed, none of it actually required the sacrifice of children. That was just the price Marsh's line had demanded, because they'd discovered centuries ago that communities will accept any evil if you convince them it's required for their survival, even when it isn't, even when the whole structure is just cruelty for cruelty's sake, disguised as religious necessity. The entity Marsh served didn't need child vessels. It simply enjoyed them, enjoyed the taste of innocence corrupted, enjoyed the aesthetic of small bodies transformed into impossible shapes, enjoyed the fact that it could make an entire town complicit in atrocity for no reason other than the pleasure of proving that humans would, given the right incentives, choose comfort over morality every single time. But Sarah didn't know that yet. Chained to her pillar in the dark, her body burning with the first stage of transformation, her child mind trying to process horror beyond its capacity, while the 6 other vessels watched with their modified eyes and their missing tongues and their transformed flesh, serving as preview of coming attractions, as promise of what awaited her in the months and years ahead. She pulled against her chains once, twice, then stopped, because she could feel that they were connected to something deeper than stone, that they ran down through the mountain into layers of earth where normal metal shouldn't exist, but did anyway. That struggling only made them tighter, only drew her further into the working, only hastened the process. So instead she hung there in her burlap-wrapped bleeding feet and her thin dress already soaked with sweat from the fever the liquid had induced, and she began the process of fracturing, began breaking her consciousness into pieces small enough to survive, began the internal work of creating spaces in her mind where Marsh couldn't reach, where some small core of Sarah Hadley could hide and wait and watch and remember. Because even then, even at 11, even chained and poisoned and alone, some part of Sarah understood that memory would be her weapon, that bearing witness would be her revenge, that if she could just survive, just endure, just maintain enough selfhood to record what happened, then someday, somehow, this would end, not for her, but for the sequence, for the working, for the long chain of atrocity that Gallows Creek had allowed to continue for 200 years. She didn't know how she knew this. Maybe it was something in the liquid she'd drunk, some side effect Marsh hadn't anticipated. Maybe it was simply the stubbornness that runs in certain bloodlines, the same stubbornness that had let her great-grandmother survive cholera, and her grandmother survive childbirth 7 times, and her mother survive 6 years of marriage to Thomas Hadley, before the 7th pregnancy finally killed her. Maybe it was just the universe's way of maintaining balance, of ensuring that every atrocity eventually finds its accountant, that every secret eventually finds its voice. Whatever the source, Sarah made a decision in that moment, her first real choice since entering Marsh's cabin. She would survive not to escape, but to remember, would endure not to be rescued, but to document, would maintain enough humanity to carry this story forward to whatever end awaited. And 30 years later, when they finally dug up her grave and found 3 silver coins in her mouth, and the journal she'd somehow written in her own blood on the inside of her ribcage, journals that detailed every name, every date, every child, every atrocity, every townsperson who'd participated or profited or simply looked away, they would understand that Sarah Hadley had won, had weaponized her own suffering, had transformed herself from victim into evidence, had ensured that Gallows Creek could never simply forget what it had done. But that comes later. Right now, it's still the first night, and Sarah is just beginning to understand the shape of her cage. And Marsh is climbing the stairs back to the surface with the satisfaction of a craftsman who's acquired a particularly promising piece of raw material. And in town, Thomas Hadley is drinking his 2nd silver coin, and the children of Gallows Creek are sleeping peacefully in their beds, protected by the screams of children nobody will acknowledge or mourn. And the winter night settles deeper over the hollow, and everything is exactly as it's been for 200 years, except that this time, this sequence, this vessel is different, and the difference will matter in ways none of them can anticipate, and the price will finally come due, and when it does, it will consume everything, everyone. The entire cursed town and everyone in it, swallowed by the secret they fed for so long, devoured by the evil they called necessary, erased from maps and memory as if they'd never existed at all, which is what they deserved, which is perhaps the only justice possible for crimes this vile, this casual, this absolutely, utterly unforgivable. The first year passed in fragments, in pieces of time that didn't connect properly, like a book with pages torn out randomly so the narrative lurched from scene to scene without transition or logic. Sarah would be chained to her pillar, then suddenly she'd be lying on a stone table while Marsh cut symbols into her skin with a blade that cauterized as it carved. Then she'd be back at the pillar with no memory of the journey between. Then she'd be brewing another cup of the red liquid that burned like swallowed fire. Then weeks would vanish entirely, and she'd wake to find her body changed in ways she hadn't consented to or witnessed. Her fingers had become longer, the bones extending until each digit was nearly double its original length, giving her hands a spider-like quality that made simple tasks like eating nearly impossible until she learned to compensate. Her left eye had changed color from brown to that same gold reflection that Marsh's eyes showed, and when she looked at things with that eye, she could see layers of reality that shouldn't exist, could perceive the symbols on the walls, not as static carvings, but as living things that moved and fed and grew, could watch the chains that bound her, extending down through dimensions of space that had nothing to do with the simple three she'd known before. The other 6 children, the vessels who'd come before her, taught her what they could without language. The coral-fingered girl, whose name had been Elizabeth before names were taken, showed Sarah how to sleep, standing up in the chains, how to lock her knees and shift her weight so circulation didn't completely stop, how to find the position where the iron cuffs caused the least damage to flesh that never quite healed right anymore. The boy with too many eyes, once called Thomas, like Sarah's father, which felt like a cruel cosmic joke, demonstrated through gesture how to identify which cups of liquid would merely hurt versus which would cause transformation. Though Sarah quickly learned that refusing the transformation doses only meant Marsh would force them down her throat anyway, would hold her jaw open with those wrong-jointed fingers, and pour until she swallowed or drowned. So cooperation was just choosing the illusion of choice, was pretending agency where none existed. The girl who'd been Margaret in her previous life, managed to communicate through a complex system of deliberate solidification and transparencies that the transformations followed a pattern. That Marsh was building toward something specific, that each vessel was being modified to serve a particular function in some larger mechanism, they couldn't yet perceive. On the 47th day, Marsh took Sarah's tongue. She'd known it was coming because she'd watched him do the same to a new vessel before her. A boy of 9 who'd lasted only 3 months before his body rejected the treatments, and he died screaming blood, his modified organs rupturing in sequence like a string of biological firecrackers. Marsh had seemed more annoyed than upset by that failure, had disposed of the body with the casual efficiency of someone discarding a broken tool, had immediately sent word to town that he required a replacement, and within a week another child had been sold and delivered and chained, and the sequence had continued without pause. The tongue removal happened in the cathedral, on the stone table that was stained so dark with old blood it looked black. And Marsh didn't use anesthetic because pain was part of the process, was necessary for the binding, was the price the working demanded for the transformations it enabled. He made the other vessels watch, positioned them in a circle around the table so Sarah could see their faces as she screamed, could see the pity and relief and hunger in their modified eyes. And he used a tool that wasn't quite scissors and wasn't quite a blade, but something between, something that seemed to exist slightly outside normal space, so that when it cut, it severed not just flesh, but something deeper, something connected to the ability to name and define and claim ownership of experience through language. The pain was absolute, was total, was the kind of agony that should have caused unconsciousness, but didn't, because Marsh had given her something beforehand that kept her awake and aware through every second, that magnified sensation rather than dulling it, that forced her to experience the removal with crystal undeniable clarity. And when it was done, when her tongue lay on the stone table like a small pink creature that had crawled out of her mouth to die, Marsh sewed the wound closed with thread that glowed faintly blue and spoke words in that language of eye-hurting symbol. And Sarah felt something fundamental change, felt her relationship to language itself alter, felt the ability to speak her own story slip away like water through those elongated spider fingers. But here's what Marsh didn't know, couldn't have anticipated, because it had never happened before in 200 years of sequences. Sarah had prepared for this. During those first 47 days, in the fragments of time when she was alone in her own head, she'd been practicing a different kind of language, one that didn't require a tongue, one that existed purely in the arrangement of thought and memory and intention. She'd been building an internal library, cataloging everything she witnessed in structures of pure cognition that didn't need words to maintain coherence, that could survive the loss of speech because they'd never relied on it in the first place. And so when Marsh took her tongue, He took her voice, but not her voice. Took her ability to speak, but not her ability to testify. Took the physical organ, but not the function it served. And that distinction, that gap between what he thought he'd removed and what Sarah had actually preserved, would become the crack in his working that would eventually shatter the entire structure. After the tongue removal, Sarah earned her first privilege, unsupervised time in the upper regions of Marsh's property. Not freedom, not even close, but the ability to move beyond the cathedral, to climb those 147 stairs and walk through the cabin, and on certain days when Marsh was occupied with other aspects of the working, to step outside into air that didn't taste like rot and incense. She learned quickly that escape was impossible, that the boundaries of Marsh's land were marked by more than simple property lines, that crossing certain thresholds triggered reactions in her modified body that ranged from paralysis to agony, to a compulsion so strong it was like being controlled by invisible strings, her legs carrying her back toward the cabin, whether she wanted them to or not. The contract her father had signed in blood hadn't just sold her to Marsh, it had bound her to him with ties deeper than law, had made her his property in some metaphysical sense that overrode any attempt at self-determination. But within those boundaries, she could move, could observe, and most importantly, could reach the structure the locals called the Bone Church. It sat a quarter-mile from Marsh's cabin, connected by a path that seemed to shift and relocate itself, so that sometimes the walk took 5 minutes and sometimes 30, depending on variables Sarah couldn't identify. The church itself was small, a single room with rough wooden pews and an altar made from a massive slab of stone that predated the building around it, and the walls were decorated with what appeared to be decorative elements, carved panels, and architectural flourishes that looked religious and appropriately somber if you didn't examine them too closely. But Sarah, with her modified gold eye, could see what they really were: bones. Human bones, children's bones. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, worked into the very structure of the building, mortared between the wooden slats, arranged in patterns that served double duty as decoration and as binding symbols, as if the church itself was a massive three-dimensional spell written in the calcium and marrow of all the vessels who'd come before, all the children who'd been transformed and used and discarded across 2 centuries of this monstrous working. The townspeople came here for Sunday services, for weddings and funerals, for baptisms and last rites, and they sat in those pews and prayed to a god they claimed to worship, while surrounded by the physical remains of the children they'd sacrificed for their prosperity, and not one of them, not a single adult in all of Gallows Creek, acknowledged what the walls were made of, what they were sitting inside, what their faith had become. Marsh preached here every Sunday, delivered sermons about sacrifice and service and the mysterious ways of divine providence, and the congregation nodded and sang hymns and took communion, and the communion wine was red, so red, and Sarah watched from the small window at the back of the church, where Marsh sometimes positioned her as part of her education, and she understood that this was the true genius of the working, not the transformation of individual children, but the transformation of an entire community into something that could justify and sanctify and worship its own monstrous appetite. During her second year, Sarah met the other half of Marsh's operation, the public face that made the private horror possible. Dr. Horace Webb came to the cabin regularly, ostensibly to provide medical oversight for Marsh's ward, but really to monitor the transformations and ensure they proceeded within acceptable parameters, whatever that meant in the context of children being systematically modified into impossible forms. Webb was 63, thin as wire, with hands that shook from what he claimed was palsy, but what Sarah recognized as guilt made physical, the body's rebellion against what the mind forced it to do. He examined her with instruments that were half medical and half something else, devices that measured not just heartbeat and temperature, but things that didn't have names in normal medicine: aspects of her being that existed in those layered realities her gold eye could perceive. "Progression is excellent," Webb told Marsh during one of these examinations, his voice carrying the forced enthusiasm of a man trying to convince himself he was contributing to science rather than atrocity. "The skeletal modifications are integrating ahead of schedule. The ocular mutation is stable. The internal restructuring shows no signs of rejection. This vessel is remarkably resilient, much more so than the last three." "You chose well." He said this as if Sarah wasn't there, wasn't standing right in front of him, with her elongated fingers and her gold eye and her missing tongue. Wasn't a person but a thing, a project, a specimen. And Sarah understood that this was necessary for Webb, that he had to reduce her to object status to continue participating, that acknowledging her humanity would shatter whatever fragile justifications he'd constructed around his involvement. But Sarah also noticed something Webb tried to hide, a tremor in his hands that had nothing to do with palsy when he touched her, a flinch that suggested not just guilt, but fear. And during one examination when Marsh was called away to deal with some issue in the cathedral, Webb leaned close to Sarah and whispered so quietly she almost missed it. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. We're all damned for this. Every one of us. And we deserve whatever comes." Then Marsh returned and Webb straightened and resumed his clinical detachment. But Sarah stored that moment in her internal library, catalogued it alongside every other crack she'd observed in the facade, every sign that the workings foundation wasn't as solid as Marsh believed, every indication that guilt and fear were eating away at the people who enabled this, corroding them from inside even as they continued to participate. The transformations accelerated in year 2. Sarah's ribcage began to expand and reconfigure, the bones separating and rearranging to accommodate new organs that grew in spaces that shouldn't have existed. Biological structures that served functions she couldn't identify but that pulsed and contracted in rhythms that had nothing to do with heartbeat or breathing. Her spine length adding vertebrae that hadn't been there before, giving her height but also flexibility that was wrong, that let her bend in ways that should have snapped her back but instead felt natural, felt like her body was learning to move through those additional dimensions her gold eye could perceive. Her skin developed a pattern, faint at first, but growing more pronounced, a network of lines that looked like cracks or like writing in some pre-linguistic script, as if the symbols from the cathedral walls were being inscribed directly onto her flesh, making her body itself into a page of the working's larger text. And she began to understand what she was becoming, what all the vessels were becoming, what the entire sequence was building toward. They weren't being transformed randomly or for aesthetic horror, though there was plenty of that. They were being turned into components of a gate, living hinges and locks and tumblers that would, when all 7 were complete and properly positioned, create an opening between this reality and somewhere else, somewhere that the entity Marsh served had been trapped for longer than human civilization had existed, somewhere it desperately wanted to escape from. And the price of that opening was the complete dissolution of 7 children's souls. Their consciousness burned as fuel to power the breach between worlds. The working wasn't about prosperity or health or any of the justifications. Gallow's Creek had been fed for 200 years. It was about release, about letting something ancient and hungry and utterly inhuman back into a world it had been banished from, and every sequence that had failed before had simply been practice, had been Marsh's line perfecting the method across generations until they finally got it right. Sarah learned this not from Marsh, but from the phasing girl, Margaret, who managed to time one of her solid moments to coincide with one of Sarah's visits to the cathedral, and pressed something into Sarah's elongated hand, a small piece of bone with writing scratched into it in a substance that might have been blood, but glowed faintly blue like Marsh's thread. The symbols hurt to look at directly, but when Sarah used her normal eye and let her gold eye sort of unfocus and perceive them slantwise, they resolved into meaning, into a message that must have taken Margaret months to compose and carve. Gate, 7 keys. Opens when last key completes thing beyond will consume everything. Gallows creak first, then spread. Marsh promised power, but thing lies. We all die. Stop it. Only you can. You're different. They see it too. Use it. Sarah closed her spider fingers around the bone message and felt it crumble to dust, as if its purpose was complete, as if the working itself was designed to erase evidence of its true nature. And she looked at Margaret with both her normal eye and her gold eye, and saw that the phasing girl was already mostly gone, her solidity occurring less and less frequently, her consciousness bleeding away into whatever dimension she partially existed in. And Sarah understood that Margaret was burning herself out intentionally, was using the energy of her own dissolution to maintain enough coherence to warn Sarah, to pass along the information that might, possibly if Sarah was clever and lucky and strong enough, allow her to sabotage the sequence from inside. Because Sarah was different, the other vessels were broken, were shattered by the horror and the pain and the transformation, until they became passive, became willing components who served the working, because resistance required a cohesion of self they no longer possessed. But Sarah had fractured deliberately, had broken herself in controlled ways that preserved her core, had created internal spaces where she remained. Sarah, even as her body became something else, and that made her dangerous, made her the first vessel in 200 years who might be able to might be able to turn her own transformation against Marsh, who might be able to save not herself, but the sequence, not her life, but the world beyond Gallows Creek that didn't even know it needed saving. The question was how. She was still chained for most of each day, still monitored constantly, still dependent on Marsh for the doses that kept her transforming body stable enough to survive. She couldn't run, couldn't fight, couldn't speak even if there was anyone who would listen. All she had was observation, was memory, was the internal library she was building, of every detail of the working, every name of every person involved, every weakness in the structure. And somehow she had to transform that knowledge into action, had to find the crack that would shatter, that had to become not just witness but weapon. Year 3 began with a death. The boy with too many eyes, Thomas, who had been, finally reached the end of his transformation sequence, and instead of becoming a completed component of the gate, he simply collapsed, all those eyes closing at once like a building going dark floor by floor, and he died there chained to his pillar, without ceremony or acknowledgement, just stopped being alive between one moment and the next. Marsh examined the body with clinical interests, taking notes in a journal written in that eye-hurting script, and then called for Webb, who came with his black bag and his shaking hands, and together they performed what they called an autopsy. But what was really a harvesting, removing the organs that had grown in impossible spaces, extracting fluids that glowed colors that didn't exist in normal light, carefully carving out those modified eyes, one by one, and preserving them in jars filled with liquid that smelled like the communion wine from the bone church. And Sarah watched all of this with her gold eye and her normal eye, and understood that Thomas's death wasn't failure but success from Marsh's perspective, that the boy had served his purpose, had provided data that would help perfect the remaining transformation, that his harvested parts would be incorporated into the church itself, would become more bones in the walls, more components of the binding that held Gallows Creek in thrall to this ancient atrocity. Within a week, a new child arrived, a girl of 8, sold by a father even more desperate than Thomas Hadley had been, and she was chained to the 7th pillar and given her first dose of red liquid, and the sequence continued without pause, without memorial, without anyone outside the hollow acknowledging that a child had died in service to their prosperity. But something changed after Thomas's death. Sarah felt it in the way Marsh looked at her, in the increased frequency of Webb's examinations, in the whispered conversations between them that stopped abruptly when she came near. They'd noticed something about her transformation, something that deviated from the pattern, something that both excited and worried them. Her modifications were progressing faster than any previous vessel, her body adapting to the treatments with efficiency that suggested either remarkable strength or something else, some quality they hadn't anticipated. And Sarah understood that she was approaching a threshold, was nearing the point where she'd either become the first completed component of the gate or she'd die like Thomas. And Marsh didn't know which outcome awaited, was for the first time in his long, terrible life uncertain about a vessel's trajectory. She used that uncertainty, started taking risks she wouldn't have dared before, testing the boundaries of her chains, exploring the full extent of her modified body's capabilities, learning what she could do that Marsh didn't know about. Her elongated fingers could reach through gaps that looked too narrow for solid matter, could manipulate objects at distances that shouldn't have been possible, could feel vibrations in the air and stone that told her when people were approaching long before they arrived. Her expanded ribcage contained organs that did things biology had no names for, that could process the red liquid in ways that extracted its transformative properties while filtering out the components meant to cloud consciousness and ensure compliance. Her lengthened spine let her contort into configurations that made her nearly invisible in certain angles, that let her occupy shadows in ways that defied normal understanding of space. And her gold eye, that eye that let her see the layers of reality, began to show her something new, the structure of the working itself, the way all the pieces connected, the flows of energy that ran from the cathedral to the church, to the town, the binding symbols that held it all together, and most importantly, the weak points, the places where the structure was imperfect, where 2 centuries of repetition had created fault lines that the right pressure at the right moment might crack wide open. Sarah memorized those weak points, catalogued them in her internal library alongside everything else, and began to formulate not a plan, because plans required resources and agency she didn't possess, but something more like an intention, a direction she could move toward if opportunity ever presented itself, a way to turn her own transformation into the thing that would break the sequence rather than complete it. Year 4 was when the town really began to participate actively rather than passively. They'd always known what was happening in Marsh's Hollow, had always profited from it, but they'd maintained a careful distance, a plausible deniability that let them pretend their hands were clean even as they counted their coin and admired their healthy children and enjoyed harvests that never failed. But in Year 4, Marsh required more from them, required active involvement in preparations for what he called the culmination, the moment when all 7 keys would finally be complete and properly aligned, and the gate would open, and the thing beyond would emerge, and everything Marsh had promised would come to pass. Though, of course, what he'd promised was lies, and what would actually happen was consumption, was the entity devouring first Gallows Creek, then spreading outward until it had consumed enough to anchor itself permanently in this reality. Mayor Samuel Pritchard organized the town's participation, called meetings in the Bone Church where he explained to the congregation that they were approaching a sacred moment, that their generations of faithful sacrifice were about to bear fruit, that the prosperity they'd known for 200 years would be multiplied beyond imagination if they would just participate in this final phase, this culminating ritual that required specific actions from specific people at specific times. And because the people of Gallows Creek had spent 2 centuries justifying their complicity, had built elaborate internal structures of rationalization that transformed child sacrifice into religious duty, they agreed, they volunteered, they competed for the honor of participating in this culmination that would either elevate them to something beyond human or more likely damn them absolutely. Sarah learned about this through Webb, who'd become increasingly erratic in his visit, who sometimes examined her with his usual clinical detachment and other times broke down entirely, weeping and confessing and begging forgiveness from a girl who had no tongue to grant it, even if she'd wanted to. During one of these breakdowns, Webb told Sarah everything, the full extent of the plan, the role each townsperson would play, the timing of the ritual, the fact that she was scheduled to be the final key, the last component to be completed, the one whose transformation would trigger the gates opening and the entity's emergence, and that her completion was scheduled for 3 weeks after her 16th birthday, which meant she had maybe 6 months left before she went from vessel to fuel, before everything she was would be burned away to power the breach between worlds. "You have to understand," Webb sobbed, his shaking hands gripping Sarah's elongated fingers with surprising strength. "We thought it was real. We thought the prosperity was real, that the bargain was real, that we were trading suffering for survival. But it's all been a lie. The crops would have grown anyway. The children would have been healthy anyway. The wealth would have come anyway. Marsh's line just convinced us otherwise, just made us complicit for the pleasure of it, for the entertainment of watching good people transform themselves into monsters through choice rather than compulsion. And now we're trapped. The binding runs too deep. If we stop, if we refuse, the backlash will kill us, will kill our children, will destroy everything. So we have to continue, have to see it through, have to participate in this final horror, and hope that maybe the entity will be merciful, will grant us something for our service, even though every indication is that it plans to consume us first and most completely, because that's what we deserve. That's the only real justice for what we've done." Sarah listened to this confession with both her eyes, seeing Webb, with her normal vision, as a broken old man drowning in guilt, and with her gold eye as something more complex, as a soul that had splintered under the weight of its own choices, and was now held together only by momentum and cowardice, and she felt something she hadn't expected: pity, not forgiveness, never forgiveness for what Webb and the others had done, but pity for the particular hell they'd constructed for themselves, the prison of complicity they could never escape, even through death, because death would only bring them to whatever judgment awaited souls that had sacrificed children for comfort and called it faith. But pity didn't mean mercy, and understanding didn't mean Sarah would let them complete the working. She'd been observing, cataloging, preparing, and Webb's confession gave her the final pieces of information she needed. The timeline, the specific mechanism of her transformation's completion, the moment when she'd be most vulnerable, but also when the entire structure would be most unstable, balanced on the edge of culmination with all its components active and exposed. That moment, that precise instant when they tried to burn her consciousness as fuel for the gate, that was when she could act, when she could turn the working against itself, when she could use her intentionally fractured self as a weapon rather than a tool. The plan formed itself in her internal library, organizing naturally from all the observations and memories and knowledge she'd accumulated, and it was terrible, was going to hurt in ways that would make the last 4 years seem gentle, going to require her to not just sacrifice her life, but her death, her very soul ground up and scattered in specific ways, at specific times, to jam the mechanism at its most critical points. But it would work. She could see it with her gold eye, could trace the flows of energy and the points of failure, could calculate with absolute certainty that if she could maintain coherence through the final transformation to execute 7 specific actions in 7 specific moments, she could collapse the entire work, could seal the gate permanently, could ensure that the thing beyond remained beyond, trapped forever in whatever prison it had tried so desperately to escape. And more than that, more than just stopping the gate, Sarah could ensure that Gallows Creek paid for what it had done. The binding that held the town to Marsh's working ran both ways. It not only compelled their participation, but made them dependent on the working's continuation for their very existence, in some metaphysical sense. If Sarah could collapse the working suddenly enough, violently enough, the backlash wouldn't just kill the participants, but would erase them, would remove Gallows Creek from reality so completely that it would be as if the town had never existed, all records gone, all evidence vanished, all memory of the place, and the people scattered into the void, which wasn't justice exactly, but was the closest thing to it Sarah could deliver from her position. 6 months, she had 6 months to perfect her understanding of the working, to practice the fractured coherence she'd need to maintain through the final transformation, to prepare herself for the most important and most terrible act of her short, agonizing life. And during those 6 months she watched Gallows Creek prepare for its own culmination, watched the townspeople rehearse their roles in the ritual with the enthusiasm of people who thought they were participating in their own elevation rather than engineering their own erasure. And she felt no guilt about what she was planning to do to them, felt nothing but the cold satisfaction of symmetry, of people who'd chosen to sacrifice children for comfort, discovering that their comfort itself was the real sacrifice, that they'd traded everything real for a line, that the price was coming due with interest. The rehearsals began on a Tuesday in October, 5 months before Sarah's scheduled completion, and they happened in the Bone Church under Marsh's direction, with a formality that bordered on theatrical. The entire adult population of Gallows Creek attended, 63 people ranging from Mayor Pritchard down to the newest arrivals who'd been in town just long enough to bound by the working's subtle compulsions, and they arranged themselves in patterns Marsh had diagrammed on parchment that looked disturbingly like anatomical drawings, as if the congregation itself was being transformed into a single organism, with specific organs and functions. Sarah watched from her position in the window, her elongated fingers gripping the frame, her gold eye tracking the flows of energy that connected each person to the working's larger structure. And what she saw confirmed her suspicions about the binding's nature and gave her additional information she could use when the moment came to collapse everything. Each townsperson was connected to Marsh through threads of something that wasn't quite light and wasn't quite substance, but existed in that layered reality her modified vision could perceive. And those threads ran not just to Marsh but through him to something deeper, something that pulsed beneath the church and the cabin and the hollow itself, something vast and patient and absolutely convinced of its coming freedom. But the threads weren't uniform in strength or quality. Some people, the ones who'd participated most actively in selling children or facilitating the sequences or simply profiting most blatantly from the working's benefits, had threads thick as rope that pulsed with dark vitality. Others, the ones who'd tried to resist or had participated only under duress, or who'd maintained some kernel of moral revulsion despite their complicity, had threads thin as spider silk that flickered and wavered, as if they might snap entirely if enough pressure was applied. Webb's thread was interesting, halfway between thick and thin, dark with guilt, but not quite dark enough to be irredeemable. And Sarah marked him in her internal library as potentially useful, as someone whose thread she might be able to sever cleanly rather than letting it whiplash back and erase him along with everyone else. Not because he deserved mercy, but because, having one witness survive, one person who could carry the story forward and ensure that what happened in Gallows Creek was remembered rather than simply vanishing into historical silence, might serve a purpose larger than justice. But she wouldn't decide until the moment came, until she could see with absolute clarity what Webb would choose when given one final chance to do the right thing. Marsh explained the culmination ritual in language that mixed religious terminology with older words from that eye-hurting script. And the townspeople listened with expressions that ranged from ecstatic anticipation to poorly concealed terror, and Sarah understood that they'd reached the point where the cognitive dissonance required to maintain their justifications had become unsustainable, where they had to either fully embrace what they were or shatter under the weight of acknowledging it. And most of them were choosing embrace because shattering required a courage they'd spent 2 centuries systematically eliminating from their community's character. Each of you has been assigned a specific moment and a specific action, Marsh intoned, his gold eyes sweeping across the congregation with satisfaction. When the final key reaches completion, when the vessel's transformation achieves the necessary threshold, you will perform your assigned action in the assigned sequence. The precision matters, the timing matters. One error, one hesitation, one moment of doubt or mercy or conscience, and the entire working collapses. And the backlash will destroy not just the sequence, but all of us. Will erase everything we've built across generations, will render meaningless every sacrifice we've made. He paused, letting that threat settle into their bones, leveraging their self-interest and fear to ensure compliance, and then continued with the false promises he'd been feeding them for so long. But if we succeed, if we execute the culmination precisely as designed, the gate opens, the entity emerges, and we are elevated. We become the first witnesses to divinity's return, the chosen people who facilitated the bridging of worlds, and our reward will be transformation of a different kind, will be the shedding of our limited human forms for something greater, something that will let us exist in both realities simultaneously, that will grant us power beyond anything our ancestors imagined when they first made the bargain that founded this community. Every word was a lie. Sarah could see it with her gold eye, could perceive the actual flows of energy that would occur during the culmination, could track what would really happen to the townspeople when the gate opened. And it wasn't elevation but consumption, wasn't transformation but dissolution. The entity using their collective consciousness as additional fuel to anchor itself more firmly in this reality before spreading outward to devour everything else. But they wanted to believe. Needed to believe, because believing Marsh's lies was easier than accepting that they'd spent 200 years murdering children for nothing, that their prosperity had been coincidence or simple hard work dressed up as divine favor, that they'd transformed themselves into monsters, not because it was necessary, but because it was easier than choosing differently. So they nodded and memorized their assignments and practiced their positions and convinced themselves that what was coming was apotheosis rather than annihilation. And Sarah watched them rehearse their own destruction with something approaching amazement at the human capacity for self-deception. The first crack in the facade appeared 3 weeks before the scheduled culmination, and it came from an unexpected source. Mayor Pritchard's daughter, a girl of 14 named Adelaide, who'd been raised in the shadow of the working but had never directly participated, had never been required to acknowledge what her father and the other adults were doing, because children were carefully shielded from the explicit details, even as they benefited from the results. But Adelaide wasn't stupid, and she'd spent 14 years watching children disappear, watching families grieve publicly while accepting payment privately, watching her father return from meetings in the Bone Church with expressions that mixed satisfaction and horror, and she'd reached conclusions that her elders hoped she'd never reach, had understood truths they'd worked hard to keep obscured. She came to Marsh's cabin alone, walking through snow that was starting to fall early that year, as if the weather itself was responding to the instability in the working. And she knocked on the door with the confidence of someone who'd been told her entire life that she was special, that her family's position meant she deserved respect and consideration, that the rules that applied to others didn't quite apply to her. Marsh opened the door with surprise that quickly transformed into calculation, because Adelaide's arrival represented either a problem or an opportunity, depending on how he handled it. And Sarah, positioned in a corner of the cabin where she'd been practicing her contortions into shadow angles, watched the interaction with both her eyes and understood immediately that Adelaide was about to make a choice that would determine not just her own fate, but potentially the fate of the entire sequence. "I know what you're doing," Adelaide said without preamble, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands that betrayed her fear. "I know about the children. I know what happened to Sarah Hadley and all the others. I know my father has been helping you, that the whole town has been helping you, that everyone I've ever known is complicit in something so evil. I don't even have words for it." She paused, swallowing hard, then continued with words that must have cost her everything to speak. "And I know you're planning something for next month, something big, something that involves everyone, and I came here to tell you that I won't let it happen. I'm going to the federal authorities. I'm going to tell them everything. I'm going to bring marshals and investigators and people who have the power to stop this. And if my father and everyone else gets arrested or hanged for what they've done, then that's what they deserve." Marsh regarded her with those gold eyes that reflected lamplight wrong, and Sarah could see him calculating rapidly, weighing options, determining the best approach to neutralize this threat. and what he decided on was neither force nor persuasion but something more insidious, truth. "Come inside, Adelaide," he said with a gentleness that was more terrifying than any threat could have been. "Let me show you something. Let me help you understand the full scope of what you're threatening to expose, and then you can make an informed choice about whether you really want to bring authorities into this situation." Adelaide hesitated, recognized the danger of entering, but she was 14, and certain of her moral righteousness, and convinced that understanding evil would only strengthen her resolve to oppose it. So she stepped across the threshold into the cabin that had swallowed so many children before her, and Marsh closed the door with the sound of a trap springing shut. He didn't take her to the cathedral, didn't show her the vessels chained to their pillars, or the transformations that had been inflicted on children her own age. Instead, he took her to a room Sarah had never been allowed to enter, a study lined with journals that dated back to the Hollow's founding, and he opened those journals and showed Adelaide the records, showed her the names of every child sacrificed across 200 years, and beside each name was a notation of which family had profited most from that particular sacrifice, which harvest had been especially abundant, which child in town had recovered from which illness, which business venture had succeeded beyond expectation. And Adelaide saw her own family name appear again and again and again, saw that the Pritchards had benefited more than anyone else, had built their wealth and power and position on a foundation of children's bones, and the truth that Marsh was showing her wasn't that the working was evil, which she'd already known, but that she herself had been a primary beneficiary of that evil since the moment she was born. "Every dress you've worn," Marsh said quietly, turning pages to show her the specific correlations, "every meal you've eaten, every book you've learned to read from, every moment of health and safety and comfort you've experienced in your 14 years, all of it was purchased with the suffering of children just like you. Children whose only crime was being born to families with less power and influence than yours. You are not separate from this working, Adelaide Pritchard. You are not an innocent observer who can simply report what she's seen and walk away clean. You are a product of it, a creation of it, and if you bring authorities here, if you expose what we've done, the first question they'll ask is what you knew and when you knew it, and why you continued to benefit from it, even after you understood its source." He let that sink in, watched her face transform as she processed the implications, as she understood that moral righteousness was a luxury she could no longer afford, that she was implicated by association and benefit even if she'd never directly participated, that exposing the working meant exposing herself and destroying everything she'd ever known herself to be. And then Marsh delivered the killing blow, the argument that would transform her from potential whistleblower into active participant. "The culmination happens in 3 weeks, whether you report us or not. The authorities couldn't get here in time even if you left right now. But if you try to interfere, if you attempt to disrupt the ritual or warn people or create any obstacle to its completion, the working will collapse, and the backlash will kill everyone in Gallows Creek, including you, including your father, including every person you've ever known. Your only choice is between dying uselessly in 3 weeks or surviving the culmination and being elevated along with everyone else. And if you survive, if you're transformed as promised, then you can decide afterward whether to feel guilty about the children who made that survival possible. But dead martyrs don't get to make moral judgments. Adelaide, only survivors do." Sarah watched Adelaide's face as she processed this impossible choice. Watched righteousness war with self-preservation, watched the 14-year-old girl realize that the adults in her life had constructed a trap so complete that even recognizing the evil didn't provide a path to opposing it, and she saw the exact moment when Adelaide broke, when she chose survival over morality, when she became complicit, not through ignorance, but through informed consent, which was perhaps the worst kind of complicity, because it couldn't hide behind the excuse of not knowing better. "What do you need me to do?" Adelaide asked finally, her voice small and defeated, and Marsh smiled with those 2 perfect teeth and pulled out another parchment with another diagram showing where Adelaide would stand during the culmination and what action she would perform. And just like that, the working gained another participant, another thread connecting another soul to the mechanism that would devour them all. After Adelaide left, walking back to town through snow that was falling harder now, Marsh turned to the corner where Sarah had been watching from her shadow angle and said, "You saw all of that. Of course, you see everything with that modified eye of yours, don't you? You understand that this is how the working maintains itself, how it survived for 200 years by making burned as fuel, but the town that had decided burning children was acceptable." Webb had dropped to his knees, his shaking hands clasped together, not in prayer but in something like gratitude, like he'd finally been given the punishment he'd craved for decades, like the incoming oblivion was mercy rather than justice. The fourth action came when Sarah's consciousness was nearly gone, when she was more fire than self, when the burning had consumed so much of what made her Sarah Hadley, that continuing required will beyond human capacity. But she'd been preparing for this, had practiced fracturing and reforming across 5 years of torture, and she pulled together enough coherence to reach out with her gold eye one final time and perceive the threads connecting the townspeople to the working, and she grabbed those threads not physically, but through the modified organs that could manipulate pressures across dimensions, and she pulled and the threads snapped in sequence like a terrible harp being played, and with each snap another person died, just stopped existing, their body collapsing into ash that scattered on wind that came from nowhere, their consciousness erased so completely that anyone who might have remembered them outside Gallows Creek immediately forgot they'd ever existed. Marsh was fighting to reach Sarah, but the 6 vessels held him, with strength that came from beyond their modified body, held him with the collective will of 200 years' worth of murdered children whose suffering he'd orchestrated. And he screamed as he felt his working collapsing, felt the gate mechanism destroying itself, felt the entity below raging in its prison as it realized that freedom was being stolen from it. It again, and his gold eyes met Sarah's, and in them she saw not just rage, but something like respect, like he finally understood that he'd miscalculated, that creating a vessel too perfect, too resilient, too capable had resulted in creating the instrument of his own destruction. The fifth action required Sarah to redirect the energy that was destroying Gallows Creek, to shape the backlash so it didn't just kill everyone, but erase them, removed all evidence they'd ever existed, corrupted records and memories and physical traces so thoroughly that within hours the town would be gone from maps, and within days people who'd traded with Gallows Creek would forget those trades had ever happened, and within weeks the hollow itself would heal over, would become just another empty space in the mountains, with no indication that humans had ever settled there. This was harder than the killing, required more precision, but Sarah had calculated exactly how to do it, had mapped the flows of energy that would accomplish erasure rather than simple destruction, and she executed those flows even as her own consciousness burned away moment by moment. The church was emptying rapidly now, its population declining with each thread Sarah snapped, and those who remained were screaming or praying, or simply staring at their hands as they began to fade, as erasure crept up their limbs like invisible fire consuming them from existence itself. The 6 vessels released Marsh finally, their purpose complete, and they stood in their circle and looked at Sarah with their modified eyes, and they smiled, actually smiled, because they understood that she'd done what none of them had been strong enough to do, had chosen to spend herself completely to ensure this never happened again, and one by one they let their own threads snap, let themselves be erased, choosing oblivion over continuing to exist as the monsters Marsh had transformed them into. Marsh made one final attempt to save his working, lunged through the space where the vessels had been, and reached for Sarah with hands that were dissolving even as they stretched toward her. And he managed to grab her shoulders with fingers that were already more concept than substance, and he looked into her eyes with his gold eyes that were fading to normal brown, then to nothing, and he spoke his final words, not in the eye-hurting language, but in plain English, words Sarah heard not with ears, but with whatever remained of her consciousness. You've damned us all, but I suppose we damned ourselves first. Tell them if there's anyone left to tell. Tell them what we did. Tell them what it costs. Then he was gone, was ash, was nothing, was removed so completely from existence that the cabin and the church and the cathedral below began to collapse, as if the will that had held them together had evaporated. The sixth action came when Sarah was barely conscious, barely herself, barely anything except fire and will and the desperate need to complete what she'd started. And it involved sealing the gate permanently, not just preventing this opening, but ensuring it could never be opened again. And to do that she had to burn the final pieces of her consciousness in a very specific way, had to pour what remained of herself into the cracks in the barrier between realities and let her soul itself become mortar that would hold those cracks closed forever. The pain transcended pain, became something that language couldn't touch, that human experience had no reference for, and Sarah felt herself scattering, felt the coherent self she'd maintained for 16 years, fragmenting into pieces that would never reassemble, felt death approaching, not as darkness but as a kind of terrible light that would consume everything she was and had been and might have become. But before she let that happen, before she executed the seventh and final action, Sarah took one last look with her gold eye that was already fading, one last perception of the working in its death throes, and she saw Webb, still standing at the back of the church, still existing when everyone else had been erased, and she understood that his thread hadn't snapped because she'd chosen to spare him, had decided in that final moment that having one witness survive, one person to carry the story forward and ensure Gallows Creek's evil was remembered rather than forgotten, was more important than complete justice. She caught his eye across the dissolving space, and she nodded once, a gesture that conveyed both responsibility and trust, that assigned him the task of testimony, that commanded him to live when dying would have been easier, and to remember when forgetting would have been merciful. The seventh action was simplest and hardest. Was Sarah finally letting go, finally stopping the fight to maintain coherence, finally allowing what remained of her consciousness to burn completely as she sealed the gate permanently, and ensured the entity stayed trapped, and Gallows Creek vanished, and the working ended after 200 years of atrocity. She felt herself dissolving, felt the boundaries of self becoming permeable, then transparent, then non-existent, felt the fire consuming the last fragments of Sarah Hadley, who'd been sold at 11, and was dying now at 16, and her final thought wasn't pain or fear, or even triumph, but something simpler, something that might have been relief, might have been peace, might have been the recognition that she'd turned her suffering into weapon, and her death into victory, and her erasure into the thing that would finally stop this ancient evil from spreading beyond the hollow that had birthed it. Dr. Horace Webb walked out of the bone church into snow that was already beginning to cover the ash that had been 62 people moments before. And he was alone, completely alone, the only human being in a hollow that had just been deleted from existence by a 16-year-old girl who'd understood that some evils can only be stopped by those willing to burn themselves completely to seal the wound. Behind him the church was collapsing, its bone walls crumbling as if the children whose remains had been incorporated into the structure were finally being released from their service, returning to dust as they should have done decades or centuries ago. The cabin was gone already, just a depression in the snow-covered ground where something had stood, but no longer did. The cathedral beneath had sealed itself, the 147 stairs filling with earth and stone, as if the mountain was healing over the infection that had been carved into its flesh. Webb walked back to what had been Gallows Creek and found it empty, found buildings standing but hollow, found doors open to homes that no longer contained any evidence that people had lived in them, found the records office with its ledgers blank, found the church registry with no name, found his own house erased of family photographs, and personal effects as if Horace Webb had never had a wife or children or a life beyond his medical practice. He was a ghost haunting a town that had become a ghost itself, and he understood with crushing clarity that Sarah had given him the worst punishment possible, not death, but memory, not erasure, but the burden of being the only person who would ever know what had happened here, who would carry forward the testimony of 200 years of atrocity that the world would never believe because there was no evidence left except his word. He tried to leave, thought perhaps he could reach the next town and tell someone, anyone, what had happened. But when he reached the boundary of what had been Gallows Creek's territory, he found he couldn't cross it, found invisible walls that didn't stop him physically, but stopped him absolutely nonetheless, and he understood that Sarah had bound him here just as surely as the working had bound everyone else, had made him caretaker of this empty place, had sentenced him to live out whatever remained of his days as the sole witness to absence, to the negative space where a town had been. He returned to the hollow where Marsh's cabin had stood, and he found a shovel that had somehow survived the erasure, and he began to dig, began excavating the place where he knew the cathedral had been, and he dug for 3 days straight without eating or sleeping. Dug with the obsessive focus of a man who needed to do something, anything, to give shape to his punishment. On the 3rd day he found the place where Sarah's body had fallen, when her consciousness finally burned away completely, and he found her remarkably preserved, despite the 3 days, found her lying in earth that had sealed over her like a tomb, and he found 3 silver coins in her mouth. The same 3 coins Thomas Hadley had accepted as payment for his daughter 5 years ago, somehow returned to their source, somehow completing a circuit that made Webb laugh and sob simultaneously because the symbolism was so perfect, so terrible, so absolutely appropriate. He lifted Sarah's body with his shaking hands and carried her up to the surface and buried her properly in ground behind where the bone church had stood. Buried her in earth that contained the ash of 62 erased people and the dust of bone walls that had held children's remains. Buried her in the heart of the evil she'd destroyed, and he marked the grave with a stone on which he carved with his medical tools the only testimony he could offer. Sarah Hadley, 1824, 1840. She chose fire over silence. Webb lived for 30 more years in that empty hollow, sustained by something that wasn't quite natural, that was, perhaps, the final mercy or cruelty of the working's collapse, that kept him alive specifically to be witness, to be memory, to be the single point of continuity between what had been and what would come after. He filled journals with everything he remembered, every name of every child sacrificed across 200 years, every detail of every transformation, every moment of complicity and cowardice and moral failure, and he wrote it all in clear, precise language, because he understood that testimony requires clarity, requires precision, requires the kind of unflinching honesty that he'd failed to demonstrate in life, but could at least achieve in writing. And then in 1870, 30 years after the culmination, a geological survey team, working for the federal government, came through the mountains and stumbled on Webb's Hollow and found an old man living alone among ruins they couldn't quite explain, ruins that looked ancient but were clearly more recent, and Webb tried to tell them what had happened, showed them his journals, took them to Sarah's grave, and explained about the coins in her mouth. But they didn't believe him, thought he was a hermit driven mad by isolation, thought his journals were the ravings of someone who'd spent too long alone in the mountains, with only his imagination for company. But they were thorough in their survey work, and they decided to excavate Sarah's grave, to determine if there really was a body, or if Webb had invented that too. And when they opened the earth, they found her preserved impossibly well after 30 years, found her body still showing the modifications Marsh had inflicted. the elongated fingers, and the expanded rib cage, and the gold eye that reflected their lantern light wrong even in death. And they found the 3 silver coins in her mouth, just as Webb had said, coins that predated the United States by centuries, coins that carried markings in languages their educated surveyors couldn't identify. And they saw her rib cage, and they found something that Webb hadn't known was there, something that made them vomit and weep, and immediately understand that whatever Webb had written in his journals was true, was real, was testimony rather than madness. Carved into the inside of Sarah's ribs, etched into the bone itself in script, so fine it must have taken years to complete, was a full accounting of everything, every name, every date, every detail of the working written in her own blood, written somehow by her own hand through some method the surveyors couldn't comprehend. And they realized that Sarah had used her modified body as paper, had turned her own skeleton into permanent record, had weaponized her physical form to ensure that even if Webb's journals were dismissed as delusion, even if every other piece of evidence vanished, her body itself would testify, would speak the truth that her missing tongue could never voice. This was the twist that Sarah had planned from the beginning, the insurance she'd built into her own bones across 5 years of transformation, the final act of resistance that would ensure Gallows Creek's evil was documented in a way that couldn't be dismissed or denied or forgotten. The survey team brought Sarah's body and Webb's journals back to Washington, brought them to authorities who examined the evidence and confirmed its authenticity, and were faced with the impossible task of explaining to the public that an entire town had committed systematic child sacrifice 200 years and then been erased from existence by one of their victims who'd turned herself into a living weapon and a dead witness simultaneously. They chose secrecy, chose to bury the evidence in archives where it would remain classified for reasons of national security or public welfare, or simply because acknowledging evil of that magnitude would shatter certain comfortable myths about American virtue and moral progress. But they sent a military unit back to the Hollow with orders to burn everything, to ensure nothing remained that could be excavated or studied or potentially reactivated. And those soldiers reported that when they arrived, they found the Hollow already burning with blue-green fire that consumed everything it touched, but produced no smoke, fire that burned for 3 days and 3 nights before finally extinguishing itself, leaving nothing but scorched earth where Gallows Creek had been, and in the center of that scorched earth they found Webb's body, finally released from his 30-year sentence, finally allowed to die now that Sarah's testimony had been delivered to people who could verify and document it, even if they chose not to publicize it. The soldiers also reported something else, something that appeared in their official reports, but was dismissed as exhaustion-induced hallucination. They claimed that on the final night of the burning, they saw figures in the flames, dozens of them, children with modified bodies and missing tongues, and they saw those children dancing, actually dancing in the fire that was consuming the last physical traces of their suffering. And the soldiers said the children looked happy, looked free, looked like they were finally allowed to leave. And at the center of the dancing children stood a girl with elongated fingers and one gold eye who looked directly at the soldiers and smiled before the flames took her and all the others, and the Hollow went dark and silent and empty forever. Sarah Hadley's body was placed in an unmarked grave in a military cemetery outside Washington, with her bone-written testimony carefully documented and sealed, her 3 silver coins melted down and destroyed, and a notation added to her file that read simply, "Witness, Hero, Warning." The file remains classified to this day, remains sealed in archives that the public cannot access, but every few decades, someone in the government with appropriate clearance reads Webb's journals and examines the photographs of Sarah's bone testimony, and asks the same question: how many other Gallows Creeks are out there? How many other communities have made similar bargains? How many other children are being sacrificed right now for evils we've chosen not to see? And what will it cost to stop them? And who will be brave enough to choose fire over silence when their moment comes? Those questions remain unanswered, and the hollow where Gallows Creek stood remains empty, and Sarah Hadley remains dead. But her testimony lives in those sealed archives, waiting for the day when someone decides that the public deserves to know what happened, deserves to understand that evil doesn't require monsters, only requires ordinary people, choosing comfort over morality consistently enough and long enough that atrocity becomes tradition, and tradition becomes invisible, and invisible evil becomes the foundation on which entire communities are built, until someone like Sarah comes along who's willing to burn it all down, including herself, to ensure that foundation never supports anything ever again.